it's an honor to be in the company of these other amazing artists, including Richard. Sorry, my voice is a little hoarse, but I've been getting over a cold. I guess I'll talk about how I arrived at making this piece. It requires a little background. I'll try not to start in Stanford Hospital where I was born, but although that's where it really does start. So I fell in love with nature as a kid, and some of you've heard this narrative, so forgive me. Growing up in Easton on a street called Ketchel Street, I lived 2 houses away from the house where I grew up. There's 2 Ketchels over there, in case you're interested in the history of the street. We're up against the Easton Reservoir, so basically our street dead ends on the reservoir, but used to continue into town. But when they dammed the Mill River to form the Easton Reservoir, our piece of Easton got stuck on the other side. But what it meant, decades after that was built, when I was born in 1975, and through the 80s when I could walk, I had access to, a lot of woods, and it was off limits to the public, which made it even better because it was my woods. As long as I was willing to cross that invisible boundary between public and not public, or past that no trespassing sign. So incidentally, the title of this piece is Invisible Boundaries. And throughout my career, I would say the most common thread that's carried through is the idea that humans draw lines in the landscape, but nature requires interconnectedness and movement and migration in order to be healthy and to continue. So humans love boundaries. We love them so much, and everything that's sort of contentious about the world has to do with boundaries, whether it's boundaries between countries or between races or gender identities. It's all about drawing lines between species, but we have to draw lines. I've come to terms with the fact that we have to draw lines in order to communicate, in order to navigate, but we have to recognize that these lines are artificial and not really what nature's about. I arrived at this kind of query or inquiry about naming and ordering nature and conceptual lines we draw in nature, not then later physical boundaries like dams and highways and diversions and levees and the ways that humans try to straitjacket nature physically, turning the map of our minds into the world, or turning the world into the map of in our minds. I arrived at this through my passion for trout as a kid. I was introduced to nature through birds, through my father, who grew up in Brazil and fell in love with little tropical birds down there. And then when he came to this country, he in particular loved warblers because they're beautiful little, actually migratory birds that spend the winter oftentimes in South America and the summer up here. So they move long distances between different countries and across boundaries. So I started drawing birds, copying Audubon and Luis Agassiz Fuertes and Roger Torrey Peterson. And then I became completely obsessed with fishing when a friend of mine introduced me to fishing at 9 years old. And then I became even more obsessed about a particular kind of fish called the trout, because I thought they were just the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, particularly the brook trout, which is our native trout, which actually isn't technically a trout. It's an Arctic char relative, but that's another story. That's actually related, taxonomy. I went to the library, because we didn't have the internet back in the 80s, with my father, who said you could learn anything in the library, and I looked for a book on the trout of North America, and I couldn't find one. So I thought at 10 years old, I'll make the book on the trout of North America, or a book. So I started writing letters to departments of wildlife around the country asking, Dear Department of Fish and Game, what kind of trout live here? And I got really nice responses to these probably handwritten letters from people who studied particular kinds of salmonid fishes in this family of trout and salmon around the country, and started developing a network of people who studied these fish, mostly biologists. And what I really wanted was a list of all the trout that I needed to paint, because in order to paint a book on all the trout, I needed to know what kinds of trout there were. But no two biologists could agree on how many species there were. And not only that, they couldn't agree on what a species even was. So I'd relied as a kid on these field guides where, you have rows of birds lined up like soldiers, and then a list of names at the opposite page that matches up to the birds. And I relied on that order and actually sought it out when my things at home became turbulent or my parents broke up, whatever. That order is what helped me sort of survive. I loved being able to rely on something. But then it turns out by the time I was 12 that order is actually largely fabricated by humans. In order to navigate biodiversity or to describe things, we have to take an interconnected, holistic continuum and chop it up in pieces and put labels on them in order to use language until we find a better way or different way to communicate. We, of course, have painting and dance and sculpture and music and other forms of communication, but language is a pretty good one, and it works pretty well. The problem isn't language itself, it's that we create this map by fragmenting and naming the world, but then we forget that this world that we've created to navigate the world isn't the world, it's just a representation of the world. And but we love it because it came out of our brains, and we love our brains, so it's a cyclical conversation. Nietzsche wrote about this in a book whose title I can't remember. But anyway, so this became a kind of lifelong obsession. What do we do about this? And there's really nothing we can do about it except constantly try to remind ourselves that we're patterns, our brains are pattern-seeking machines that love to draw lines. And then once the lines are there, we defend those lines. We live by lines, we die by lines. It's happening right now all over the world. So the flag, let's see. Okay. So yeah, and I realized then over the years that I was choosing subject matter to write about, because I also write books, or to do exhibitions about, that were all about boundaries. Like I wrote a book about eels. Richard came by the studio, I think, when I was working on eel stuff, and I think he thought it was quirky, but maybe he liked it. But eels are creatures, the eels that live in our rivers spawn in the ocean, but live their adult lives in freshwater streams. So they're traversing thousands of miles. I mean, they spawn east of Bermuda out. Like if you catch an eel in the Mill River in Easton, that eel was born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and had to cross that ocean as a baby, come up the mouth of the Mill River in Southport Harbor, all the way up. And I've gone electrofishing, which is how biologists do sampling. It's got to hurt them somehow, but they just go, and then they float up, and you net them, and then they revive, and you let them go. And that's how it seems very draconian, but that's. And we were electrofishing at the top of the Mill River, above the Easton Reservoir, above many dams. Like there's the St. Mortar Reservoir Dam, there's the Easton Reservoir Dam, which is quite formidable. And we caught a big eel in the creek above all these dams. And I'm thinking, how the hell did this fish get in here? And there's two possibilities. It either came up and was able to somehow get through or over the dam as a baby, because when they're little, they're very adept at climbing. Even a wet wall, they can climb. I was down in, I think it's the Mianus River. There's a dam, and next to the dam, there's a concrete building, and right next to the dam. And I was going there to watch the migration of the little baby eels in the spring, because I was told by this person at the Nature Conservancy that you can literally see them climbing up the dam, because it's just a thin film of water, and it's probably like 15, 20 feet. Not only were they going up the dam, it had rained the night before, and they'd gone up the building, like up the side of the concrete wall. And then there were all these dead, dried eels on the side of the building. They're unbelievable creatures. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that fish is actually old enough that it came up the Mill River before the dam was built. There's eels in New Zealand that have been aged over 100 years, which is about how old that dam is. So, and this was probably 20 years ago. So having an 80-year-old eel is not. The third possibility actually is that it came up the Pequannock River, which probably still has dams, but did they take down the Beardsley Dam? No, they didn't. Anyway, it could have come up the Pequannock because the water company made an artificial headwater connection between the Mill River and the Pequannock River. That's another story. Anyway, I'm getting off track. But I've been attracted to animals that trespass across the boundaries or try to overcome the boundaries that humans have put in their way, migratory fish. And then I worked on an exhibition with an ecologist who studies wolf and elk relationships in Yellowstone, and a photographer who was working on shooting the migrations. We worked on an exhibition at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, about migration of animals in and out of the park. So there's a boundary. It's basically a rectangle, the park boundary, that was created by this geologist named Ferdinand Hayden when they created the park in the 1870s. And it's this invisible line. There's no fence around it. And visitors to the park might think, oh, the animals stay in here. But really, virtually almost all the animals leave in the winter. Like tens of thousands of elk cross that invisible line in the winter onto private lands from the park. And there's about 6 or 7 radiating herds. So on one side, we may think, oh, the lines in our minds, these invisible boundaries don't affect anything, but they do in profound ways. On one side of that line, the elk is protected as a tourist attraction, and once it crosses that line in the right season, it can be shot by a hunter. So same with wolves and a lot of other creatures. Anyway, so at some point, my art dealer friend, who some of you may know, named Waqas, he's like, why don't you do a flag? Every artist has done a flag. So I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. So I started thinking about, what do I have to say about the American flag? I hadn't really thought that much about it. But when I looked at it, I realized, first of all, there's nothing organic on most flags. Most flags are grids of colors and boxes and stars, which aren't part of this earth, although the sun makes it all possible to live here, and the sun is a star. But the Mexican flag has an eagle. I think it's actually a caracara and a snake. Caracara is a scavenger, so the Mexicans don't want to think it's a caracara, but I think when it was drawn, anyway. Yeah, I looked at the flag and I'm like, it's just all about boundaries and lines. The 13 colonies, boom, 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 boom. And, you know, and we love our boxes, we love our borders between states. You fly over this nation now, which was once an interconnected, holistic, rolling prairie that native people burned 10,000 acres, hundreds of thousands of acres. They basically burn the continent every year to create healthier grass, bigger populations, remove trees, create more grass, because more grass means more a higher population of grazing animals. We can't metabolize grass, but we can eat things that eat grass. So they were basically ranching North America. A lot of modern ranchers will say, we don't raise cattle, we raise grass, because without the food that the animals eat, you don't have anything. And I've read over and over these myths that the native people weren't like doing anything. They were just sort of like invisible in the landscape, but they were consciously managing this continent for thousands of years, changing the land significantly. But their way of managing the land was about interconnectedness. There were no fences, there were no property lines. That all came later with Europeans and a whole new ideology. And then the cultivated grasses that a lot of indigenous people spent thousands of years creating, like corn, by selectively breeding these grasses. Corn, wheat, barley, rice, sugarcane, all grasses. So this cultivated wave of grasses came to replace our beautiful native prairies. And so one, it was like a grass war. And when it was replaced by basically a monoculture. And if you fly over the prairies now, it's just a grid. It looks like the flag. It's terrible. I mean, for nature, it's about the worst thing you could imagine. But people need to eat, you know. We don't, just like language, we have a better way to feed people than growing shitloads of corn. I don't think so. I mean, but it's a pretty dull drive across the United States. Not that much, really, because there's all these cool McDonald's signs and things. But, and photographers like, you know, Robert Frank and others have made the most of it. But it used to be insanely beautiful. And if you visit a remnant prairie and there's almost nothing left of it, you'll understand what I mean. Connecticut had a ton of prairie. We had prairie chickens living in New England. They were called heath hens. And that's one piece of evidence that this landscape was completely different. It was not a forested Eden. It was a mixed forest grassland habitat. So these animals don't know the boundaries are there because they can't see them, and they're crossing the lines. So that's basically what this is about. There's an animal for each of the 50 states, because each state has, you know, a state reptile, a state flower, a state bird, and they change sometimes. Sometimes people lobby, oh, we don't want our state reptile to be a rattlesnake, and they'll change it to the spotted salamander. But at the time, this is what I had to go with. There's also like 5 or 6 states that have the bison as their state mammal. So I kind of like found a different animal to represent each state. Connecticut's represented by the robin, which is down, let's see, I think that's a robin. And striped bass is Rhode Island, the paddlefish is Missouri. I think the moose is Alaska, the humpback whale is Hawaii. There's 2 squirrels. Somebody thought that squirrel looked like a money sign. And they're like, oh, that's really political. Are you sure you want that? Like, the only thing I changed about that painting is the money sign. And I was like, the money sign? I don't see a money. So sometimes people see things that we don't see. So I started playing with arranging these animals in a circle. Seemed like a good idea because I think early flags weren't the stars in a circle. And then, of course, the eagle, which has become a symbol, which, you know, Benjamin Franklin was against because he thought they were aggressive, mean-spirited birds, unlike turkeys, which was his preferred. So I'm glad we're not turkeys. I like eagles. But that's basically it. So I appreciate this opportunity. I mean, it's it, but it's not it. I could keep talking, but I think
it's perfect, and we should see if people have questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a personal question. Cody's artwork going.
Oh, Cody. Okay. We have a 8-year-old boy named Cody, and he's more diligent than I am as a drawer. I'm on email all day, and he can sit for hours and draw. He loves to draw, which I love that he loves to draw. Brilliant child. Yeah, well, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you. By the way, thank you all my friends and family who have come here today. I could name you all, but you know who you are, and neighbors who are family too. Yeah, I'm very lucky. We're very lucky, but he I don't know, in terms of raw talent, I think he's got more than I had at his age, but which I hope, you know, I hope he has fun with it. Hi, Steve.
In terms of symbolism, I see a circle of life of all these various, some are sea creatures, some are land creatures, and some are air creatures, but we're all ultimately tied together.
Yes. Was that a question or not?
No, that's a comment. That's an observation.
No, thank you, Steve. Steve is a good friend and a collector of shaker stuff, which I've become obsessed with, and he's been teaching me stuff about shakers. But yeah, some of you may have seen other works I've done where I cluster all these silhouettes of animals together, and they're kind of about this idea that it's an intricate web that can't really be pulled apart. Even though, yes, a cat is different than a tree, and we need a system of classification to deal with that so we can talk about things. In a sense, they're not really separate. They're part of the same ecosystem. And our discussion today, our brain waves are shaping the future of creatures on this planet. Everything we do, it's just too complex for science to quantify or to try to describe at this point. Maybe that's the purpose of art. But I've started thinking a lot how nothing in nature ever really goes away, which should be comforting to all of us as mortals. Like if you visit a piece of remnant prairie that's never been plowed, overgrazed, developed, destroyed by all the ways that we destroy things in nature, and that, like an ancient piece of grassland that's never been molested, it feels different. If it's over 100 acres, you'll hear birds that you won't hear in other places, meadowlarks, bobolinks, bobwhites, all kinds of sparrows. And it feels different. If you visit enough of these spaces, and I think, this guy from the Nature Conservancy, I was walking through this prairie outside of Houston, Texas, and he's like, even though the big herds of bison that used to roam here and mowed the prairies, we needed that maintenance. They were basically big lawnmowers. And the reason why your grass grows back when you cut it is because it evolved with grazing animals. I mean, most plants, you cut them every 2 weeks, they would die. But grasses actually like that torture because they evolved with it. So he's like, even though the bison aren't here anymore, in a sense, they're still here because the plants evolved in their presence. The plants were influenced by their grazing, that they shaped the plants. So every one of those plants carries, I've started to refer to as like a ghost signature of all these animals. Extinct species are still with us. We just can't describe their presence. But, so I've been trying to articulate this in works I'm making now and in writing. But anyway, sorry for the digression.
The state animals that you picked, I don't know when they were picked for each state, but has any of them disappeared since?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. A quick Google search could answer our question. But it's possible either A, that a state has adopted an animal that's extinct, or there are animals that some people are debating whether they're extinct or not, like the ivory-billed woodpecker. Some ornithologists say that there still might be one out there, but we haven't really had a confirmed sighting since the 1940s, I think. And it's also possible that they had an animal that went extinct, and whether they kept it or not, I'm not sure, but that I don't know. It's a good question, though.
You've traveled around the world. What is one of your most memorable events that really puts a star on your cake?
Well, most memorable events from travel. I would say, I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is this trip I made with my friend Christoph, who's the ornithology collections manager at the Peabody Museum at Yale, and he's a bird brain. Totally, like he's a bird savant. Like he doesn't think like a normal human. He's just sort of birds and nests. And so the Peabody still goes on collecting trips to different parts of the world to basically murder animals and put them in the collection. They call it collecting, but and I was interested in this process because I've been working on a book for like 20 years about this process of naming and ordering nature. And historically, and still to this day, you can't name an animal or plant unless you collect a specimen, basically prove that it exists. They've tried doing it with like taking a blood sample from a bird and photographing it, letting it go, but the bird dies anyway, because if you're in the tropics and you start molesting the poor thing, it's not going to probably live. So you might as well kill it. So I wanted to go on an old-timey biological expedition. I thought these things were relics of the 19th century, but Some institutions still do it, including the Peabody. So we planned a trip to central Suriname, which is if you don't know where Suriname is, and I didn't before I went there, I thought it might be in Africa. It's a former Dutch colony north of Brazil, the only Dutch-speaking country in South America. So that alone makes it weird to go to a place in South America and not hear a Latin language, like Spanish or Portuguese. But anyway, it was memorable because Suriname, first of all, is a very strange place. Because it was a Dutch colony, there's people from all over the world living in a very sort of smallish city, but in a very good kind of melting pot way, like Javanese, Chinese, Pakistani, Indians, Africans, everything. I mean, and there's all kinds of cool fusion cuisine. And but we had to get into the interior, because if you want to find things that haven't been named, you try to go to some place where people haven't been, because if people have been there, there's names all over every place. So the Field Museum in Chicago and other institutions had tried to get into the interior, but it was just, they gave up because there's no navigable rivers. You can't really walk into the forest. So we decided the only way we could get in there was by helicopter. And nobody flies. There's only 3 helicopters in the whole country. And nobody flies into the interior unless they're dropping off geologists to look for bauxite, which is the biggest export from Suriname. But that's all in the lowlands, so nobody goes in the mountains for any reason. There's no reason to go in the mountains. So we didn't even know if we could land the helicopter, because you could see bare spots on Google Earth, but you don't know if they're at a 40-degree angle. Or we thought about sending a helicopter beforehand, like somebody could sort of rappel out of it and cut a landing zone in the forest, but that would have been too expensive. Just the helicopter trip alone was, I think, $19,000 cash we paid them to take us in and out. So anyway, we almost had to make a crash landing because we got into this fog and we were running out of fuel. And the pilot, we didn't talk about it on that particular day because we were all so just kind of like, did that really happen? What was happening? And I had thrown up all over myself and down my shirt, and he was bobbing up and down. Luckily, it was a guy who'd grown up in Alaska as a bush guide, so he'd flown in a lot of really bad stuff, and he'd also flown in the military. And so that was memorable. I mean, I was so sick that I was looking down at the forest where he was literally thinking about trying to land in an area where there was no space. And I was thinking, please kill me. I am so sick. Like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. I really didn't care at all. I was so surprised that I was like, I really please wipe me off the planet. But at the last second, the Surinamese guy who was in the loadmaster had like a Post-it note taped to the inside of the helicopter with the coordinates of a village that he's like, I think this village is near here. And I think the river's like east of us. Maybe if we go try to find the river, we can follow the river to the village. And last minute, the pilot decided to do that. And so I reached out to him 10 years after this, because we're prone to overblow, or overblown, to inflate events that happen or whatever. I was wondering, like, how serious was this, And I never talked to the pilot about it. Actually, the guy who flew us out 3 weeks later, we did finally get to a site and collected birds for 3 weeks. He went missing, and they didn't find him or the other people's bodies for like 5 years, but they crash landed in the forest somewhere. Anyway, which was very sad. And I only found that when I was Googling, the Hijet was the name of the company. I was trying to find the American pilot who brought us in to ask him, like, how serious was this? And I finally found him on Facebook, and he's like, of all the years I was flying, like in the military and blah, 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 that was the single most hairy sort of moment. And he's like, I wrote a 10-page story for my kids about it, and he sent it to me. And it was, he made a decision to go to the river and then follow the river to the village. And then literally we all saw like the clouds part, and there was an open meadow and like houses and like little huts. And he put the helicopter down and he said, the rotor stopped right when we landed. Like, he ran out of fuel the second we, like maybe even a millisecond before. So anyway, that was memorable, but not just that, the 3 weeks after that, and they just happened to have left a fuel canister in this village. So we were able, like 5 years before, so we were able to refuel and actually try again. And we did, and we made it. We found a spot to land, and we were up there with nets and guns for 3 weeks. And I wouldn't have blamed the mountain for killing us, because the killing of the birds started to get old after a while. And I'm like, Christoph, we already have 3 of these. Like, do we really need another one? So I started like secretly letting birds go from the net. But so that trip, we still talk about it. And Christoph turns 60 next weekend. There was something really special too for my naming project about going to a place where I don't know if people have ever been on these little mountains, because other than for ritualistic reasons, there's no reason anybody would. Even the 2 guys, Surinamese guys we hired to cut trails for us, they're like, we're not leaving this rock where we landed. You're not paying us enough to cut trails. So we had to just go wander around. But I started thinking about what it means to make a trail in an area that nobody's ever really walked around, because it takes a lot of effort to walk through the forest without a trail. So once you cut a trail, you really don't leave the trail. But I'm somebody who doesn't like to stay on the trail. I like to trespass. So I'm like, but I just made the trail. Does that mean it's a new trail? And then we, in terms of naming, like, without me even thinking of it, and sorry I'm going on, I'll stop. We started naming the trails, like this is a water trail, the trail to where we get water, and this is the bellbird trail because we killed a bellbird. And it was just amazing how we populated that forest with names, like really quickly, because we have to, I guess, to be efficient. But it made me really realize that there are no names or words on the world. We put them there, and that changes things, just like the lenses in Richard's piece. It alters our perceptions. And I've been trying to investigate how that happens and why. So anyway, so that was one memorable trip. Want me to talk about the next one? No.
I think we have to stop there.
Yeah,
but
thank you. Thank you, Carrie.